Alright guys, welcome to the first of several recaps that I'll be doing for the Canadian Open Chess Championship this year. This is held in Hamilton and I'm recording this from the residence room. But anyway, this is round one and I was black against Rachel, who's around 1850. So let's see what happened here. She played d4, c4, all standard, and I played the QGD, and then she proceeded with an early bishop g5 here. So typically they play knight c3 first, but the one downside of this bishop g5 move order is that it does allow me to take on c4 at some points, which could give black a good position. So I start with h6. The idea is that after bishop to h4, I'm always free to play g5 to kick the bishop back if I need to. Let's say after I take on c4, if white were to play e4 here, then g5 would just win a clean pawn on e4, so that's no good. So she plays e3 here, trying to win back the pawn on c4 immediately, but then I go bishop to b4, followed by b5. And right now I'm claiming that I am holding on to the pawn for now, but of course white has ways of dealing with this. This isn't, the cleanest pawn ever. I believe white should first start with a3 as she did in the game. The problem is if you go for a4, I think that c3 is quite strong because I kick the rook back and then maybe I can go b4. This might be good for black. So she starts at a3 to question my bishop because now if I go bishop to a5, I might have problems after, let's say, bishop takes f6. I thought that this was a problem after a4 because my bishop is sort of hanging here and I don't really have a good way of dealing with this, other than to take the knight on d2. But that would allow white to free her pieces a little bit. So anyway, after a3, I went back to e7, and now she did something that was a little bit unexpected. She took an f6 right here. I thought initially that the idea was to later play a knight e4, hitting the bishop, and force my bishop to move back, let's say, and then maybe open up the queen side with moves like b3 and a4. But here she ended up going with b3 first, and now of course I can't push past because after knight e4 she would just win a pawn. And I don't really want to take here either because after she takes b5 comes a check, and I'm in a little bit of trouble here. So right here, I thought that my position was going to be a little bit worse here because the queen side is opening up in white's favor, and white is going to be able to develop her pieces quite quickly. But then I was inspired, and I had an idea here to complete my development. So what black really needs to try to do is he really needs to try to fight back in the center somehow, because there's no way that you're going to be able to hold on to these brittle pawns here, right, on b5 and on c4. So I started bishop to b7, important move by the way, because I have to control this diagonal. I have to stop the knight e4 coming with tempo at some point. And then after she takes on c4, of course she just wants to take all my pawns here, and then her structure will be fantastic. I beat her to the punch with the really nice move c5. Now this bishop e7 combined with c5 is just an idea that I came up with on the fly, and I didn't even know it was that great, but it ended up being, it turns out that it was actually the top engine recommendation from this point here. To go bishop b7, followed by c5. Of course, white cannot take because the rook hangs in the corner, although this was interesting, because if I take here, my g7 pawn is hit, and there could be some chances for white to get two pawns in the fifth like this, but I don't quite know what the move here is. Okay, the engine is saying to take on f3 here, which is very interesting. Queen hg7, there's king e7, and the idea is that if you take here, there's queen a5 check, which is an idea that I was trying to get at some point. But gf3, and then apparently you can either take on c4 and allow queen takes g7. It gets very messy, but I think that I should be fine here. But okay, here it's saying that the better way to deal with this is just to go knight d7 and win this pawn back right away. So let's go back here. After bc4, I go c5. And then she supports the d4 square with the knight with knight b3. But the issue here is that it's a little bit artificial and it's actually not very easy for white to hold on to this d4 square as effectively as she would like. So I take on d4, of course, that's my whole idea, and now white's in a little bit of a dilemma, because if you just take back immediately, I think that knight c6 is quite strong, because after takes, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that I can give a check. There to be a check on c3, and then I can take back the knight on c6, and I'd be ahead there. Otherwise, the knight's sort of unstable here, and I want to trade queens here because that would give me a solid structure in the endgame. But anyway, she takes on b5 and invites a queen exchange this way. So I take on e3, we trade, I take with the king in order to keep the pressure on the rook, although she forces my king to move anyway on the next move. After king e7, fe3. Now we have this really interesting middle game, queenless middle game, where black has two really nice bishops, but at the moment white's covering a lot of squares. White can put a knight on d4, white has a queenside majority that she can push in the future, and white's going to be able to develop her pieces quite quickly with this, and let's see, rook d2, and rook h to d1 to double up the rooks. But in the meantime, I will have control over the c-file with moves like rook hc8, maybe bishop to d5 to hit the knight, and once my pieces get out, I think that I should be ahead here objectively. So I start with knight d7, why not? Bishop to e2, rook h to c8, king f2, and then I infiltrate with my rook on c3. These are all just very natural moves. And then after a long think, she played rook to d3, which I expected. I mean, she just wants to get rid of a pair of rooks. I double up the rooks, and then she does the same, and then I block the d file of my bishop. Now it looks like she might have the move e4 here, but actually I just take the rook, and she takes with the bishop, then the knight hangs here. And if she takes with the rook, then after bishop takes e4, there's no longer a hanging knight on d7. So that all works out for me. So she goes knight d4, knight f4, a good move here, and then I go knight e5 to hit the rook. This may have been a little bit inaccurate. I think that the engine was pointing out some weird variation, starting with bishop takes b3, and somehow this is a little bit better, but I'm not entirely sure how that line works out. But anyway, I start with knight e5, and the one downside to this move is that it does simplify the position by allowing all the rooks to be traded off, which I'm not sure is something that I want to allow as black, right, if I'm playing for a win here. Now after rook to c1, takes. Obviously white is at least a little bit better because the king is more active, you still have the bishop here, and you have a really nice knight restricting the enemy king and some of white's pieces. Now first I start with king b6, I improve my king, and she goes knight c to b3, getting the knight back in the game. Now it's important to note that the tempting move knight to c4 to hit the pawn is actually a blunder because that allows pawn to e4. And you're not quite losing material, because I think that after bishop to a8 takes, you're going to be able to fork the pieces or something like this, but it's just not a good trade for me. Anyway, I need to prepare knight c4, so I go bishop to c4, which was probably the first real mistake of the game on my part. These really aren't pieces I'm wanting to trade off so quickly, because I will need the light squared bishop at some point. If white supports the pawn on b5, then the pawns will be fixed on light squares, so I may want to preserve that bishop for the future, but honestly at this point I didn't really see another way to proceed. I mean, it's really hard to play this and try to convert, because it looks like white will just be able to move his knight somewhere, maybe go knight f3, trade off all the pieces, go bishop to f3, and it's just really unclear on what I should be doing here to improve my position. So I go bishop to, sorry, skipped all the way ahead there. Oops. Okay, go back here. So I go bishop to c4, and then she plays the best move, knight e5. Now this is really annoying because now she has increased control over c6, which would help her win the a7 pawn, and she also has access to knight b7, because if my king moves, then maybe there's knight to d8 in some lines attacking, or knight to d6 rather, knight b7 to d6 check, which would hit the f7 pawn. So this forces a trade, I take, and then I play a very precise move to go king c7 here. It might look better to go king c5, going for this route, or rather it may look like they're the same thing, right? You either go king c5, king b6, or you go king c7, king b6 as I played in the game. But I correctly judged that king c5 was inaccurate in view of knight to b7 check. Because now, if I go king b6, now there's knight d6, the move that I mentioned earlier, and now I believe white will be able to liquidate just fine with moves like that f3 or even knight c6 to trade off the knight, and then white will be able to just take on f7, and once f7 falls in, the whole structure just collapses, and there's no way I'm winning that endgame. So I go king c7, not to allow knight b7. And now I believe if you put one of your knights on c6, this does allow me to go a6 and try to open this up. But maybe there's a4 and things get swapped off, but I'm not exactly sure on that. Anyway, she went to a4 just to support the pawn preemptively. I go king b6, that's planned. After knight a to b3, I have to be careful. She is threatening to push the pawn on a5, and if she goes a5 now, if I allow pawn to a5 check, then it's actually white who may be willing to push for a win with the two pawns, cutting off my king like that. So I go knight to c4, which is the only move to maintain my advantage. I have to stop the pawn check. She goes h3, just a waiting move. But now this is a fatal mistake because I actually calculated this throughout, and I was able to see about 10 moves ahead and confirmed that I will be winning this endgame following bishop takes d4. And no matter how white recaptures, I would be able to win one of these pawns by force. Now it's not immediately clear that I'm winning that because white does get her fair share of counterplay in both lines. So let's look at both lines here. Let's look at knight takes d4. Knight takes d4, I was playing knight b2 here. And I believe the best way for her to play this is either knight c6 or a5 check. Let's say knight c6 takes a4 and knight to d8 going after these pawns. But I wasn't too afraid. I mean, I felt like my pawn was just way too faster, and I don't think she would be winning more than one of these pawns here. And long term, I would just have a passed pawn on the a5. So that's why she took with the pawn. This is a little bit more challenging because after knight b2, there's knight c5, and now I have to spend a move. I have to get my king to a more awkward square just to win the a pawn, and this may give white the time she needs to create counterplay. So she goes knight b7 check. This is really the only chance for white. I don't really see another way. I mean, there's knight d7 followed by knight e5, maybe using some weaknesses on the side of the board, trying to win these pawns that way. But after this, I take on a4. I believe king b4 was a little bit more precise, just to avoid some checks in the future and to get my king to a better square, because ultimately I want to take on a4 with the knight, not with the king, because that's a little bit better for my coordination. So I take on a4, and then she goes knight to d6, defending the pawn and attacking f7. So I played one of the best moves here. I'm actually really happy I played this. I found this move, which is f6. And the idea of playing this move is it might look like, I'm just moving a pawn forward like this, and it's not anything special, but if I go f5 here, now this pawn becomes super weak, and if this pawn falls, now white will have a passed d pawn that will be very dangerous. So I have to remain a little bit more flexible here. I believe after pawn f5, I think the engine was wanting to, no, it's all still better for black, but it's not as clear as just going f6. I think f6 is the much safer way to defend the pawn. After f6, I saw that white would be able to play knight to e8, but I was planning on just moving my g-pawn, just saving my g-pawn, because if you just take on f6 here, after king takes b5, again, I have a passed a-pawn, and if the white king tries going back to defend that, then my king will just come in, take this pawn, and then I would have an a-pawn and e-pawn running up the board. And again, this knight is just too slow to find the correct path to win one of these pawns. So that was what I was planning, at least. After f6, she goes knight to c8, and now she's going to be winning this pawn, so I have to trade this. And now I have to be a little bit careful. As long as my king is nicely centralized, then I should be able to pick off this pawn at some point. And with that, the game, because 4v2 is obviously a very easy win in that case. So she goes king to e3, I give a check on d1. We were nearing time control. I think she was the one who was lower on the clock. So I played some moves a little bit quickly to put some more pressure on her. And after knight c3, if she had gone back, then I was planning on attacking this pawn at knight to b5 and also inviting a trade, which obviously she should not accept because this endgame is easily winning. But after knight to b5, knight to c6 would be the only way to defend the pawn. I was intending knight to d6 here with the idea of going knight to f5 next and maybe winning the pawn. I don't know what white really has here, maybe g4 to stop that, but again, it feels like I'm definitely pushing here. It just looks very difficult for white to defend. But in the game, she just shocked me by playing knight takes b5, because after king takes b5, this is just easily winning. Maybe just fix the pawns, and yeah, I was just very shocked that she just went for that. Maybe she didn't see that knight c6 resource, but yeah, the rest of the game was just smooth sailing. And yeah, she just allowed mate on the board on g8. But yeah, I thought this entire endgame was quite interesting because I wasn't really sure I wasn't really sure how to evaluate this position, like around this point right here. Sorry, a little bit before that. Like right around here, I wasn't really sure who was better here. I do have the two bishops still, but it's really unclear how I'm going to make use of them because right now this knight is just very, very solid on d4. It's defending b5 and it's nice and centralized. Maybe a better plan would have been bishop to d8 at some point to prevent this knight a5 idea, and then eventually I'm going to be able to force some concessions on the other side of the board, perhaps. But yeah, I thought that if white just sort of stayed put, then I would not have been able to infiltrate so easily. But yeah, that was the game. Again, just a very, very long endgame grind. But yeah, that was a successful game, and I will be back for the next recap of round 2.